Hello, I'm Marin Ailey, and I would like to welcome you to the RightStart Math Online Conference. I'm introducing Rachel Anderson, and she will be presenting Teaching RightStart Math to Children with Learning Difficulties or Special Needs. We do ask that you keep your questions till the end of the presentation. And just a little bit about Rachel. She has a master's of ed in special education. She's taught children with learning disabilities and coached families and teachers of students with special needs. She developed a passion for this as she realized that one of her children had significant learning struggles. As a result, she's done considerable research learning how to teach the struggling learner in her family and loves to pass on her knowledge and experience to other parents looking for help. She has used RightStart Math from kindergarten on, and in fact, she's graduated her children from RightStart Math and has been thrilled that her kids understand the math concepts given to them. Rachel, it's all yours.
Thanks, Marin. Welcome, everybody, to Teaching RightStart Math to Children with Learning Difficulties or Special Needs. As Marin mentioned, my name is Rachel, and I'm excited to share with you some ideas and ways that you can adapt lessons as you teach your kids that have learning disabilities or special needs. As Marin mentioned earlier, I have 4 kids, and 2 of them have learning difficulties. So I have had some experience both professionally as well as just in my studies on how to modify and adapt lessons. I think one of the biggest struggles that parents have who have children with learning difficulties is the misunderstanding of the freedom and the flexibility that they have to teach. So during this workshop, I'm going to share with you some ideas of how you can adapt a lesson to work with your child's specific learning needs. Now, you may not need to use all of the modifications that I am going to show you. However, I hope that by the end of this workshop, you are going to see the flexibility that you have to help your child learn math. The first step in helping your child learn is to learn about your child. What are their strengths? What are their struggles, their interests, their likes, which manipulatives work for them, and what causes them to shut down? Do they learn better in the morning or in the afternoon? When do you see your child start misbehaving, or when do you see them mentally check out? Some of the biggest, or actually one of the biggest mistakes I hear from parents is actually, get this, they spend too much time on a lesson or in a segment of a lesson. I have spoken to numerous families, even this year, who spend an hour or more working through a math lesson. Now, I totally get it. I am a type A person. I love to cross things off my list. But a longer lesson does not mean that your child will have better comprehension or even that they will comprehend the content at all. You are going to want to teach your child to your child's ability to learn. So use your time, your energy, and your child's learning energy wisely. To do that, you need to be a student of your child, observe them, and adjust to better meet their needs. The next key step is to modify. Modify. I am not going to say that enough. Now, RightStart Math is an excellent program for children with learning disabilities. However, you're still going to have to modify it to meet your child's specific learning needs. Do you have a great schedule? There's going to be days that you need to modify that schedule. Where is your classroom? What type of environment is it? You might need to adjust it or move it to better lighting, to less lighting, to natural lighting. Do you have a special length of the time that you like to teach your lesson, or a specific time of day that you want to teach math? Well, guess what? You may need to modify that. You may need to change that. Now, modification is going to be your friend if you embrace it. So for the remainder of this workshop, I'm going to work through a math lesson and show you the different ways that you can modify or adjust it without losing the integrity of the lesson. And to do so, we're going to modify it to best meet your child's needs. Now, for this workshop, I'm going to take a look at Level A, Lesson 94, and show you the different ways that you can modify it to meet the needs of a child with learning disabilities. Now, some of these options are going to work for your child, and others are not. Each child is unique. Each child has different needs. So you may actually need to modify my modifications. Now, before I even start teaching a lesson with my child, I'm going to look at the objectives. What is the purpose of this lesson? It is so easy to get sidetracked by some of the activities or topics in a lesson. So knowing the objectives is going to help you focus, laser focus on the specific skills your child should be learning during the lesson. Now, notice for this particular lesson, the teacher is introducing the term dozen. Now, notice it says introduce. It doesn't say master. It doesn't say review. It means the child is going to be introduced to the term. They do not need to have this term completely learned and mastered by the end of this lesson. It's going to be reviewed later. Now, it might not be reviewed in level A. It might be in B or C or D, but it's going to be covered later. I also see in this lesson that my child is going to be partitioning the teen numbers. Those are the things that my child will learn during this lesson. Now, each lesson starts with a warm-up. You know this. If you were teaching RightStart Math, you know this. The purpose of the warm-up is to help you know what your child is learning and what they're retaining. It's kind of like a quick quiz. It gets your child also ready to learn the new content. Now, many times the warm-up is going to include problems that your child is going to use as they learn new material in the lesson. So let's take a look at before I do that, let's consider that the warm-up also should only take a few minutes to complete. If it is taking longer, you are potentially wearing down your child's mental energy and focus time. So you're going to want to make sure that you keep this warm-up contained within just a couple minutes. All right, so if that warm-up time is taking too long, you might need to adjust that. So here's some options for you. First of all, don't ask all of the questions. You can choose just one or two of the questions. Now, this particular warm-up covers several different ideas. It covers counting by ones, counting by tens, counting by fives. It has the child add 1 and 2. It discusses parallel and perpendicular, and it has the child listening to patterns. Now, when I'm teaching my child with learning differences, I might only choose 1 or 2 of these ideas based on what I want to check on to see if my child has retained information or if they are understanding what we have previously taught. Now, maybe I know that my child counts by ones really well, but I've noticed in the last few days or weeks or whatever that they are starting to show some struggles with their fives. So I might have them count to fives, but take a look in this one. It says, have the child count by fives to 100. Well, that might be overkill for my goal. So I might have my child count by fives to only 50. Or I may have him start at 50 and count to 100 by fives. See how I'm modifying that? I also might have my child do the next section where it says how much is 43 plus 1, 44 plus 2, 78 plus 1. But I might only have them solve 1 or 2 of those, not give all 4. I also might adjust those problems to make them easier at first. For example, when I'm asking 43 plus 1, I may actually start backwards and say, what is 3 plus 1? The child's going to say 4. And then I'm going to say, what is 43 plus 1? 44. I might even ask, what is 44 plus 2? Or I might go back and say, instead of 43 plus 1, I might say, what is 53 plus 1? See how I'm changing those problems to match the needs of the child. Now, another option is to set the timer for 3 or 4 minutes and have just ask as many problems in the warm-up that you can do before moving on to the next section. Now, that being said, put your timer on vibration mode or silent. Don't let your child hear that because you do not want your child knowing that you're timing them. Why? Well, I have a very creative and a creative child in that he will get away with doing as little as possible if necessary. So if he knows that he's only going to be doing this for a certain period of time, and he knows if he just extends out answering those questions and just thinks about them too long, he knows that I'm going to cut it off. So again, make sure your timer is on vibration or silent mode. Now, when one of my sons was young, I literally only had 10 minutes to teach him new content for every hour. And then he was lost. And he was also a slow processor. So sometimes I saved those warm-up questions for the end of the lesson, or I did them at another time in the day. Sometimes that was sort of like the warm-up for the day. I would have him come downstairs and I would have these questions written on the whiteboard and let him solve it. And then we would do some other subjects and then come back to math. Sometimes we skipped the warm-up altogether, depending on the needs of my child for that day. Remember, you are teaching to your child's needs. What is best for them? Now here we move into the lesson activities in this lesson. Now I love the opening segment of this particular lesson. Notice we have several different questions that have the same answer of 12. How many eggs would fit in this carton? 12. How many eggs are in a dozen? 12. How many buns are in a dozen? 12. If I felt like my child needed extra practice, though, then I might build off what was presented in this section and add my own questions. My daughter loved horses, so I would ask something like, how many horses are in a dozen, or something like that, or how many scoops of ice cream, or how many is a dozen scoops of ice cream, that type of thing. Changing up the questions, kind of engaging them a little bit better. I also might bring in some hands-on components. Show me 12 tally sticks. Show me 12 on the abacus. Show me a dozen centimeter cubes. See how I'm interchanging those words and pulling it into a different component. I might reverse the question. Instead of saying, what is a dozen? 12, I might say, if I have 12 of something, what is it? So flipping and flopping and re-asking questions is a really good strategy too. Then, in typical Dr. Cotter style, the questions become more complex. Now, my child has pretty much by this point learned that a dozen is 12. We've kind of nailed that in this particular lesson. But now, this next question here, how many eggs are in 2 dozen? Now, that might be a little bit more complex, right, for your child. Now, I want to say a few things. First of all, don't shy away from more advanced questions, even if you think your child can't solve them. Ask the question and then wait to see what they do. This can be very telling on their understanding or their lack of understanding and their preferred method of figuring things out. For example, if you say, how many eggs are in 2 dozen? Your child might answer 22. Well, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that they've calculated the tens, but they've only calculated in one of those ones places, right? So they're almost there. The clue for you is they're really, really close to calculating this amount. Now, if your child answers 12, like 1212 is their answer, 1,212, you know your child is just squishing those 2 written forms of the number together. What's the clue for you? They do not understand the dozen or 12 as a quantity, and you may need to revisit quantities and place values. I personally, if that situation occurred to me, I personally would get an abacus out and begin working through that. Now, if you ask this question, how many eggs are in 2 dozen? Your child might ask for, can I use the abacus? Can I have the tally sticks? Or some other manipulative to help them calculate. What is that clue? What are you learning from that? You're learning that that is the manipulative that your child uses to learn. Now, by the way, if your child is using their fingers to count, then you are going to want to use the abacus more frequently and play more math card games. We want to pull them away from that counting idea and start visualizing and calculating without counting. Now, as you can see, you can learn so much about your child when you evaluate their answers. Don't just focus on whether the answer is right or wrong. Find out why it is wrong. How are they calculating the answers? Why did they answer the way they did? And this is going to help you troubleshoot and guide your child to correcting their errors. Also, when you're asking questions like this, don't rush them. Let them think through the process before you start filling in the blanks for them. I love to fill in blanks. It takes a lot of self-discipline for me to keep my mouth shut sometimes. A common question I receive is, okay, so what is a good waiting time? A half a second? Is that good enough? No, well, honestly, it will depend on your child and how quick their processing skills are. For my kids, I allowed about 5 seconds. I actually counted to help keep my mouth shut, but 5 seconds. Why only 5? Because I have kids with ADHD. If I waited longer than that, I knew my kids' minds were starting to wander everywhere. That being said, if you have a child with Down syndrome, your wait time is going to be at least 10 seconds. They need a longer processing time. If you're waiting for their answer and you start to see your child get distracted, if they change the subject, hey, mom, do you remember we did this yesterday? Or if they start glazing over, then your wait time is over and you will need to re-ask the question, get them refocused in on what we're talking about. And then this time, give them a manipulative to help them figure it out. Like for this one, I would definitely use the abacus. One is we want them also to visualize it as well as calculate the answer. Now notice, I'm not telling you to give them the answer. You are still going to let your child figure it out, but you're going to give them a manipulative for support. Then the next section of the manual has the child to show their answer with place value cards. See that there? This is huge, especially for children with dyslexia and dyscalculia. However, many children with learning differences and special needs greatly benefit from the use of place value cards. In fact, I use them practically every day as my child works through his math, or both my kids worked through their maths. Don't underestimate the power of the place value cards. Now, the next question has the child finds the number of eggs in 3 dozen. Now, at this point, I would evaluate my child's mental energy levels. If my son is struggling to keep up, I might move on to the next section from here, just to see if we can add some new material. However, if he's good to go, I'm going to ask him the question and let him use the support, the same support that he used for 2 dozen, I'm going to let him use for 3 dozen. I also might reword this question to say, what if I had 3 dozen? Now, some kids, so notice here, it'll say, ask him find the number of eggs in 3 dozen. Some kids start focusing on the object, in this case, eggs, instead of the quantity. So keep that in mind as you're asking the questions. You might just want to leave off the object if it becomes a distractor to them. Now, the last question of the section is a thick question. If my child was unable, like the question is, ask the child if it's easier to count by dozens or by tens and why. If my child is unable to count by tens, don't ask this question. If my child can't count by tens, they're not going to say one's easier than the other, right? Okay, so pull off that question. That means I'm going to give you special permission. There are times when you can skip a question. If you feel a question such as this one is going to confuse, distract, or frustrate your child, then either modify it or skip it if it's unable to be modified. Now, this question, take a listen to this. This question is not foundational to your child's learning of the material. Remember the objectives. What were the objectives? We were learning about dozen, and we were also learning about partitioning 10. Now, this is a great question to ask, and you might even want to try it and see what your child does with it. But this is not foundational to those objectives. So in that case, you can skip it. There are oftentimes too, like here it says, if appropriate, right? So Dr. Cotter even gives you some special permissions in the lesson that you can skip over it if it's not needed. Now, that being said, okay, pull back a little bit because realize your child can do more than you think they can. So don't write off all complex questions or problems. Periodically ask them these type of questions, help them to grow in their understanding. Now, the next section, so we covered dozens in the lesson, and then the next section is going to talk about partitioning tens. Before I move into this new section, this new content, I am going to make sure my child is ready for new content. If I start to see my child starting to wear out, getting all wiggly, I am going to put a sticky note on this section. And then depending on the day, I'm going to return to this lesson later on in the day, or I'm going to start here the next day. Remember, just because you continue to teach does not mean your child is going to continue to learn. Work within your child's mental energy. It's going to prevent a lot of frustration for you and a lot of frustration from your child. Now, if you determine that you can move on, go ahead and continue in the lesson. Now, this particular lesson uses part-whole circles. I love part-whole circles. They are an excellent strategy and tool to use when solving word problems. Now, notice in this particular lesson, you don't see a word problem yet. So you're like, oh, do we really need to use part-whole circles? Yes, yes, you do. Don't get rid of them. Another recommendation, by the way, that brings me to another point. Another recommendation I would say is use tools and manipulatives that work for your kids, even if the lesson does not say to use them. Remember when I was telling you about the place value cards? I use them pretty much every day, even when the lesson did not explicitly tell me to. Now, for this part of the lesson, I would work through it pretty much as written. It's done very well, a lot of flexibility already built in. Be sure to use the part-whole circle set and the abacus for every example until your child is starting to show some automaticity with it. Now, notice at the very end of the section, the lesson tells you to continue with other teen numbers right there. Some lessons don't provide these suggestions for additional problems. So feel free to ask additional problems to help your child solidify what they're learning. I will do as many, for this particular lesson, I would do as many teen numbers as needed until I saw my child demonstrating proficiency in that skill. I might even review 13 and then 15 and then 17 and go back to 13, whatever it takes for my child to kind of really grasp a hold of that. Now, part-whole circles do require writing. So if your child struggles with writing, you could put it on a whiteboard. It's a little easier for them, or you can use place value cards to fill in the part-whole circles. Now, if you use place value cards, you're going to need at least 2 sets of place value cards. If you do not have more than 1 set, you can always order more through RightStart Math's online store, or there's a free downloadable file you can look up to print out some extra sets of place value cards. Now, the practice. I love how Dr. Cotter frequently encourages and provides opportunities for verbal responses. Sometimes lessons are going to have the student write their answers on journal paper or the whiteboard. Both of those options are also good alternatives to writing or verbalizing. Now, children who struggle to complete worksheets many times find it easier to write on graph paper or the whiteboard. So feel free to translate that worksheet, we're going to talk about that in a minute, onto graph paper or a whiteboard. As you work with your kids, find out what's best for them, and you can even change it up, keep it, keep it changing so they're not doing the same thing every day. Also, opposite side, if you see a section that asks for verbal responses and your child struggles with verbalizing information, let them write it down or use a manipulative to express their answer. And then, that way you know for sure whether they're getting it or not. Now, throughout the program, Dr. Cotter includes word problems or situational problems. Word problems are difficult for many kids. They can be especially difficult for children with learning differences. However, we solve word problems in our everyday life. They're going to look different and be presented to us differently, but we still have to solve problems daily. So it is important that your child learns how to evaluate and solve problems. Now, many math programs have kids looking for keywords, and you may be very tempted to just teach keywords. But the reality is, in real life, keywords can be misleading or even non-existent. For example, here is a word problem. McKenna left $5 on a table. Her brother left $4 on the table. How much money was left on the table? Well, left is the keyword for subtraction. So if your child is looking for keywords, what are they going to do? They're going to subtract 5 plus 4 instead of, or 5 minus 4 instead of what am I trying to say? They're going to subtract instead of add, right? Because they're not looking at the message of the word problem. They're simply looking for that keyword. Here's another example. Logan had 10 toy cars. 4 were green and the rest were orange. How many toy cars does Logan have? Now, in this example, there is no keyword. So what operation should they use? All right, so what do you do if you can't use keywords? How do you solve word problems if you don't use them? Use the part whole circles. Whenever you have a word problem in a lesson, get out or draw the part whole circle set. Help your child get in their own habit of writing the part whole circle set every single time they see a word problem. It will help them analyze, break down, and solve those problems. Now, here are some other strategies you can use when solving word problems. First of all, change the name of the person in the word problem. Use the child's name or somebody that they know. Help them visualize the situation so that they can make sense of it. Now, I have changed the object of the word problem too, in order to engage my child into thinking and visualizing that one. As I said before, my daughter loved horses. So many times when there was a word problem, I would modify the word problem to include horses. So this particular word problem says, Lee hid a dozen eggs. Lee's friends found 10 of them. How many of them are still hidden? How I would change this is, McKenna, my daughter's name, has a dozen horses. 10 of them were in the field. How many of them were in the stall? Now, this specific word problem is not a good example of my next point, but some word problems can include very large numbers that can overwhelm or distract your child from even knowing how to start. So I'm going to show you a word problem from level B. So here we have a word problem with larger numbers. Michaela has a book with 36 pages. Nathan has a book with 50 pages. Whose book has more pages and how many more? So instead of doing this problem as written, I would actually modify the problem to include smaller numbers so my child can focus on how to solve the problem first. Now, when modifying the problem, I'm going to use the same information, well, except I'm going to change the names and objects maybe, but I will give my child the same scenario, the same idea, but reduce those numbers. So here's a modification I might do. Michaela has a book with 2 pages and Nathan has a book with 6 pages. Whose book has more pages and how many more? Now, many times I have found even my struggling learners will do something like this and they're able to solve that problem very quickly. But before I move on with the problem with higher numbers, thinking, oh, they've got it, I'm going to go ahead and give them new ones. I'm going to ask them how they solved it, because many times they're able to tell me the answer right away, but they're not really thinking about how they got to the answer. Okay, so either way, whether they answered right away or if they're kind of fumbling with the answer, I'm going to get out the part whole circles and we're going to figure out that the 6 is the whole amount, the 2 is the parts, and how do we find the other part? They find it by subtracting. We're going to talk through that. Now, if my child was ready, I'm going to go ahead and give them the real problem. But if I felt, I'm not quite sure, I might give them another practice, and I would give them the same problem with slightly different numbers that are easier to solve, okay? For example, Michaela has the book with 30 pages and Nathan has a book with 20 pages. Whose book has more pages and by how many more? Now notice this problem is set up almost the same, except I changed the numbers out, and I also switched whose book had more, because I don't want them just automatically answering a number without evaluating. These numbers are also easier to calculate. Once I feel comfortable, then I'm going to go ahead and give my child the real problem in the lesson to solve. Now, you may not need as many steps, or you may need more. Again, teach to your child's needs. Many of the lessons, especially in the higher levels, have worksheets. When your child is working on a worksheet, let them use the manipulatives they need to solve the problems. That being said, I like to see what my child can do without the manipulatives first. So I often will have my child spend a few minutes working on the worksheet without the manipulatives. Now, if my child is trucking along fine, I'm going to just let them finish the worksheet without the manipulative support until they start showing frustration or mental exhaustion. But if my child shows those frustrations, or if all of their problems are wrong, I'm going to let them get out the manipulative, and I might even talk them through it. Keep track of your child's struggles as they're working through the worksheet, and use that information that you are learning about your child to help them learn. For example, if your child is struggling with math facts, you need to play more math card games. It means their arithmetic is not solid. You need to play more math card games to strengthen them up. If your child is struggling with the process, you're going to want to go back and review the lesson or part of the lesson that covers that instructional part of how to proceed, how to solve those problems. I have noticed many times my child knows their math facts, but they seem to be really slow at solving them. They're like kind of more molasses. Instead of 2 minutes, it's taking them 4 minutes, whatever. I'm going to have them play more math card games, because even though they know their math facts, they're not fluent enough with them. So I'm going to give them more math card games to pick up the speed of their solving of arithmetic. Now, as I previously mentioned, if your child struggled with writing, write these problems on a whiteboard or on graph paper. If you need to document their work and you're concerned about putting it on a whiteboard, just take a picture of it. That's documentation enough, just like a worksheet, except for you're taking a picture of it. You can also have your child solve problems verbally. Now, for older students solving multi-step problems, you can be a scribe for them, but they would have to dictate to you what to write. For example, if they're solving 1,234 plus 5,678, they can tell you what they're doing and what to write. They would say something like 4 and 8 are 12. So I need for you, Mom, to write 2 under the 8. Then you write 2. And then I need for you to carry the 1 over the 3. Okay. All right. Now, what if they said something wrong? So let's say they said that 8 plus 4 is 13. You write down exactly what they're saying. Then at the end, you address it. Let them progress. Let's see if they catch their own error. Okay. Don't be too quick to readjust them. Then math card games. One element that is in this sample lesson does not have is that this specific, I can't get talk. This specific lesson did not have any math card games listed. However, a lot of RightStart math lessons do. I'm going to say this: do not skip the math card games. If your child is low on mental energy and you're running low, play the math card game later on in the day. Play it before lunch, before dinner, before TV time. Play with your dad, a grandparent, on the way to soccer practice, at the park, before bedtime, whatever. Make sure you get that game in 10 to 15 minutes a day. Games are a vital part of your child's learning process. All kids need to play the math card games, but the child with learning differences absolutely need the games even more. Do not skip them. I know many parents tell me that they feel they just simply don't have time to teach the lesson and play the math card game. I often respond by saying, I would rather have you play the math card game and skip the lesson. Not really, but you know what I mean. The math card games are that important. Do not skip the games. Say that with me. I will not skip the games. Okay. We've made a commitment now. Do not skip those games. Have I made it clear? All right, I'll move on. Finally, the conclusion of the lesson. For my kids with learning differences, I did not always do the conclusion or all of the conclusion questions in the lesson. It really did depend on the day and what the questions and the conclusion section asked. Most of the time for my son, by this point, he was mentally worn out. I may, however, ask a question or two from this conclusion later on in the day or at lunch, especially if my child was struggling on an idea. I wanted to see if he got it. I would also skip that conclusion section and be done for the day if it was one of those frustrating lessons. And then I might even ask that the beginning of the following day to see if we need to redo that lesson. Basically, I wanted to know that my child learned or retained what they were learning during math. So later in the day or the next day, I might ask those questions. Then you're done with the lesson. You close the book and you celebrate. It's even more important that you encourage your child at the end of the lesson. Celebrate their wins. Let them know that you are proud of them. Give them compliments. Say, great work. Wow, that was a tough lesson, but you hung in there. Or, wow, you zipped through all of those math facts. Or, I loved how you persisted and went to find ways to encourage your child. Let them know they did a great job and reward them verbally as they complete a lesson. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that gave you some great ideas. In just a minute, I'm going to open it up for questions. But for those of you who are logging off, remember you can go to our website and view more information about the RightStart Math program. You can also email RightStart Math or me at info@rightstartmath.com, or you can call RightStart Math at 888-272-3291. I think I have a few minutes left. I'm not sure. I haven't been keeping track of time to answer some questions. So does anybody have any questions?
Cindy had asked a question about if you're skipping parts of the lessons, do you redo the lesson, or do you move on to the next lesson? And I know you touched on it, but maybe you just want to reiterate just a little bit.
Yes, so that really does depend on the objective. Does that segment really touch on the purpose of that lesson? If I am teaching a lesson and we just kind of skipped over a couple of those questions, but the rest of the lesson, they were solid, they're playing their math card game solid, their worksheets solid, I'm not going to go back. Now, if we were stumbling through and it was one of those days where it's like, oh, wow, I don't know. Then guess what I'm going to do the next day? I'm going to pick a few questions from segments and see if my child has retained that information. If they're still struggling, I'm going to teach that lesson again. I might change up some of the numbers. I might not, depending on the lesson, depending on the point. When do I move on to the next lesson is another big question. Again, take a look at the objectives. One other thing that I do is I look at the next lesson or 2 lessons or 3 lessons. If I'm hitting that same topic on another day or another day or another day, then I'm going to let it ride. I'm going to see if another day's approach is going to kind of fill in the gaps for them. There's a section in level D that works on fractions. And so it'll work on measurements. It'll work with half of a shape. It'll work with, gallons and quarts. It will cover fractions in so many different ways. And it was interesting to see the traction that was built through that whole entire progression. The first day was very sluggish, but as we progressed through that segment of lessons, my son would really just start getting traction. By the end of that segment unit, they were just really strong. So sometimes you do want to move on because it's going to approach that same topic in a unique way, in a different way, using a different manipulative or whatever. So many times if my son's kind of stumbled through, I will double check the next day on some of those questions. If they're still stumbling through, I'm going to look at the next lesson or the next 2 lessons or 3 and see if it's kind of covering the same topic. If it is, I'm going to press on and see what happens by the end of that unit. If not, I might put a sticky note in and then move forward and then come back to it, because sometimes they just need some time for it to gel. All right. So again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this workshop, flexibility. You have freedoms and flexibility. You do not need to do word for word. You do not need to do lesson every single day. You have flexibility. Come and go and review and come back and move forward and then come back and review it all again. Does that make sense?
Yes. Hi. Rachel, thank you for
Yes.
answering my question. So just to follow up with that, so if say he got the concept, do you skip lessons as well? Just kind of just move forward, you know, like he's got it. So let's carry on. Do you do that?
So I don't skip through the lesson. So let's say we're at the very beginning of that dozen section. I'm like, oh, he's got dozen. I'm just going to move on to partitioning teens. I'm not going to do that because there are subtle little things that Dr. Cotter incorporates into segments. For example, how many is in 2 dozen? How many is in 3 dozen, right? She's going to make it deeper and thicker. Now, am I going to ask all of the, you know, when we get to the teens section and we're partitioning teens and my child's like, am I going to do every single teen number? No, I'm going to do the 12 and I'm going to do the 13, I'm going to do the 19. He's got it. I'm going to move on. Right. So you see, I'm not skipping huge chunks, but I'm not necessarily doing every single example. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Sure. Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, I just want to thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to attend this workshop. I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel.